In the midst of silent nights, when your soul cries out for answers and your heart is tired of waiting, there is something God is doing, even if you can't see it. Sometimes God's silence is just the sound of heaven working behind the scenes. Have you ever felt like your life was spinning out of control, like everything was falling apart, and wondered, where is God in all of this? It's no coincidence that you're here now. There's a purpose hidden in every tear, every delay, every no you've received. This video will reveal something that you may have been searching for a long time. Stay until the end, because what is said here could initiate a profound turning point in your spiritual journey. There are times when everything seems to fall apart at once. Doors close, people walk away, dreams fall apart. But what if I told you that none of this is random, that there is a greater plan being woven by divine hands even in the darkest days? Purposeful pain is the tool God uses to align our hearts with His, shaping us for something we cannot yet see. Joseph was thrown into a pit by his own brothers, sold into slavery, unjustly accused and forgotten in prison. Anyone looking from the outside would see failure, injustice, and abandonment, but God saw a ruler being forged. Each crisis in Joseph's life was a step toward fulfilling God's purpose. The same happens to us. Our present suffering may be preparing the ground for something great. It is easy to doubt in the midst of chaos. The mind tries to understand why. The heart cries out for immediate relief. However, it is precisely in these moments that heaven works silently. Spiritual overcoming begins when we stop fighting the process and begin to trust in divine control. God's greater plan does not ignore pain. It uses it as an instrument of personal and spiritual growth. There is no wasted suffering in God's hands. What seems like a delay can be protection. What feels like loss can be a redirection. A crisis, no matter how intense, can be the beginning of a new season. That's why, in the midst of turbulence, it's essential to keep hope alive. The greater plan is still in motion, and God has never lost control. When everything around us seems to be falling apart and the ground disappears beneath our feet, there is something that needs to remain firm. Faith. Not the faith that is conditioned by what we see or feel, but the faith that remains alive even when everything says otherwise. Trusting in God in the midst of the storm is what sustains the spirit. It is at this time that we discover that we do not walk by sight, but by conviction in the divine promises. Job lost everything, his children, his possessions, his health. And even though he didn't understand why, he declared, "Though he slays me, yet will I trust in him." Job 13:15. This is the faith that cuts through the chaos, the faith that recognizes that God is still God, even when the world is falling apart. It is this faith that turns tears into prayer and despair into worship. It is in this kind of trust that we find inner peace. It is not easy to believe when everything screams that it is over. But that is when true faith is tested and strengthened. God's timing may seem slow, but it is never faulty. Prayer, even when said with a trembling voice, is a cry of spiritual resistance. It is a way of saying, "Lord, I do not understand, but I trust." And this trust in the invisible is what moves heaven in our favor. Faith in the midst of chaos is what connects us to God's purpose when all seems lost. It helps us see beyond the pain, to realize that something is happening in the unseen. God is working even in the silence, even in the absence of answers. So instead of giving up, pray. Instead of complaining, worship. Because true faith does not depend on proof. It is based on the certainty of who God is. Have you ever stopped to think that nothing escapes God's gaze? Every tear that falls, every step you take, every silence you face, everything is counted. Everything has eternal weight. God wastes nothing. Even the most seemingly useless moments are being used to shape your life. Every detail, no matter how small it may seem, has value in the greater plan that the Lord is writing. Think about Joseph again. If he hadn't been forgotten in prison, he might not have been remembered at the right moment to interpret Pharaoh's dream. That temporary forgetfulness was part of God's script. The same thing happens to us. The loss of that job, the end of that relationship, the delay in that answer, all of these things could be part of a process that is preparing you to experience something far beyond what you imagine. Behind the scenes of our lives, God is sewing a cloak with the threads of each experience. He sees the whole, while we only see disconnected parts. Trust in God's timing is born when we understand that what seems like pain today can be a testimony tomorrow. Spiritual overcoming involves understanding that details have a function to mature, refine, and edify. That is why we must not ignore the small signs, the moments of waiting, the unexpected adjustments along the way. Prayer, reading the Word, and time alone with God reveal how attentive He is to the smallest aspects of our lives. Trust in the invisible is strengthened when we accept that not a single second is wasted when we are in His hands. God has always spoken through stories, and in Scripture we find lives marked by pain, but also by spiritual overcoming. Joseph was betrayed by his brothers, slandered and imprisoned. But in the end, he declared, God meant for good the evil they intended against me. Genesis 50:20. His story is a powerful reminder that suffering can be part of the process of fulfilling God's purpose. Job, on the other hand, experienced almost unbearable pain. He lost everything he had, including his health, but he remained steadfast. When everything was restored, it became clear that his faith was not in possessions, but in the Lord. His life teaches us about trust in the unseen and how pain, when placed in God's hands, generates personal growth and deep spiritual roots. David faced rejection, persecution, and abandonment. Elijah had moments of anguish so intense that he asked for death. Ruth lost everything, but was faithful even in the face of scarcity. In each of these stories, we see that suffering was not the end, but the means by which God revealed His greater plan. What seemed like defeat became living testimony to God's faithfulness. These stories are not just old memories, they are living invitations to hope. They remind us that just as God worked in the past, He continues to work today. Through prayer, total surrender, and abiding in the Word, we can experience real transformations, because the same God who worked in the lives of Joseph and Job is also present in your journey, taking care of every detail. Pain has the power to reveal who we really are. It exposes our weaknesses, challenges our certainties, and pushes us to the limit. But at the same time, it is in suffering that we are transformed most profoundly. God uses pain not to destroy us, but to refine us. It is in this process that we learn to have empathy, to see beyond ourselves, to depend more on the sky than on circumstances. Job, after all his affliction, said, I knew you by hearsay, but now my eye sees you. Job 42:5. Suffering opened his spiritual eyes. Not only did his life get restored, but his view of God was expanded. Spiritual transformation happens when we stop resisting pain and start asking, Lord, what are you trying to teach me through this? Pain teaches us to value what really matters. It disconnects us from illusions and connects us to the eternal. It's through pain that more sincere prayers, deeper purposes, and a more solid faith are born. When we face afflictions with our hearts turned to God, something changes inside us. And this change is the true miracle. Don't run away from the process. No matter how difficult it may be, face it with prayer, constantly seeking God's presence. Each tear can water a new season. The transformation you desire may not come through immediate victory, but through the pain you are facing now. This is how God writes remarkable stories, using suffering as fertile soil for glory. Life can feel confusing when we're stuck in difficult chapters, but the truth is, we're not the authors of our story. God is, and he writes with purpose, with precision, with love. Even when we don't understand what's happening, we can trust that the author hasn't lost control of the narrative. Every page of our existence is in his hands. Many times we want to quickly turn the page on pain, delay, and frustration. But what if that difficult chapter is essential to the unfolding of the plot? Joseph's story only makes sense when viewed as a whole. At the time of his imprisonment, abandonment, and silence, it seemed like everything was going wrong. But it was the author of life preparing the climax of something grand. Trusting God as the writer of our story requires surrender. It means accepting that the current chapter, however painful it may be, is part of something greater. He does not write drafts. Each line has value, each comma is intentional. God's timing is precise, and even when everything seems to stand still, heaven continues to write with eternal ink. Therefore, do not try to write with your own hands what only the Holy Spirit can write. Surrender control, close the eyes of logic and open the eyes of faith. Pray, trust, remain, because even without understanding the present, you can rest knowing that in the hands of the author of life, the end will always be one of glory and transformation. The seed does not germinate in plain sight. It hides in the dark earth, in the silence of the invisible. But there, far from human sight, a miracle begins. This is how it is with God's promises in our lives. Many times we see nothing happening. Everything seems to stand still. But faith invites us to believe that even without evidence, God is acting in the depths. Trust in the invisible is one of the strongest marks of spiritual maturity. Abraham was called to leave his land without knowing where he was going. He obeyed, moved by an inner certainty that surpassed all logic. God works in this place of faith, where there are no visible signs, but there is conviction in the heart. Prayer in these moments is like water that waters the buried seed. It is in this silent faith that we are shaped. It is not easy to believe without seeing, but it is in this environment that spiritual roots grow deeper. When you choose to trust God even without understanding, you are saying, "Lord, I trust your word more than my eyes." And this attitude moves heaven, activates promises, and attracts favor from above. Keep believing. Even when there are no signs, keep sowing faithfulness, obedience, and prayer. God honors those who walk by faith. As it is written, the righteous will live by faith. Habakkuk 2:4. In due time, what is hidden today will begin to blossom, and you will see that every moment of silent trust was not in vain. We can't always understand why certain doors close, why what we wanted so much didn't come true. But the word assures us that all things work together for good to those who love God. Romans 8:28. This includes losses, waiting, silences, and new beginnings. God is intertwining everything into a greater plan, even when everything seems contrary. Often, what we interpret as failure is actually deliverance. That friendship that fell apart, the job that didn't work out, the opportunity that slipped away, all of these could have been God protecting us from something we couldn't see. Trust in the invisible manifests itself when we recognize that He sees what we do not see, and acts with a love that protects us even against our desires. It takes spiritual maturity to understand that good things don't always come packaged the way we expect. Sometimes God allows pain now to prevent tragedy later, and other times He turns His own pain into testimony. Inner peace comes when we accept that we are being led by a Father who knows the end from the beginning. So, even in the face of frustration, declare, "Lord, I know that this is also working for my good." Keep praying, trusting, and worshiping. In the end, you will realize that every part of your story, even the most difficult ones, was part of the path that led you to live God's best. Nothing is in vain when it is placed in His hands. There comes a time when there is no point in trying to understand. It is time to simply surrender. Prayer is that place of surrender where we give up control and let God be God. We surrender our fears, our doubts, our anxieties. We say, "Lord, take everything because I can't do it alone." This is the beginning of a transformed life when our hearts bow before heaven. Jesus in Gethsemane prayed a sincere prayer. "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, but let your will be done." He taught us that true surrender is not the absence of pain, but total trust in the eternal purpose. Prayer aligns us with heaven, strengthens us in weakness, and leads us to an intimacy that transforms everything around us. It is in this secret place that we find inner peace. The world may be in turmoil, emotions may be in conflict, but when you throw yourself into prayer and let go of control, heaven manifests itself. God does not reject a broken heart. Total surrender is not a sign of weakness, it is proof of spiritual wisdom. It is knowing that only He has the power to restore, guide, and transform. That's why today is the time. Pray. Talk to God like a child talks to the Father. Give up what is too heavy. Don't hold anything back. When you give yourself completely, God also reveals Himself completely. And it is in this surrender that a new story is born, not written by your hands, but by the hands of the Creator. Your life is not out of control. Every pain, every weight, every detail, everything has a purpose. And if there is one thing this content wanted to remind you of, it is that God has not abandoned you. He is preparing you for something great. But now, the decision is in your hands. Will you continue trying to understand everything with reason, or will you truly trust in the plan He is writing? Isn't it time to stop fighting alone and surrender once and for all? To transform pain into clamor, silence into worship, and doubt into faith? What kind of transformation is God trying to bring about in you through this difficult season? What still needs to be surrendered so that God's newness can be born? If this message spoke to your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who also needs this word. Take the opportunity to follow the channel, activate notifications, and stay up to date with content that will strengthen your faith, edify you, and lead you to a deeper relationship with God.